Hello and welcome back to our special edition covering the ongoing plenary session of the two political events, the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. I'm Yang Rui. The first session of the 13th National People's Congress, China's national legislature, opened in Beijing today. Apart from the reviewing of work reports, including a government work report, NPC deputies will deliberate on a draft revision to China's constitution, a draft supervision law, and a reform plan for state council institutions in the next 15 days. How has the government performed in the last year? What is the significance of the latest constitutional amendments, and what new targets will there be for China in the upcoming year? Today, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Dr. Hong Chen, CEO of the Hainan Group, and Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Gentlemen, welcome to our special program of Voices and Votes. Well, let's put aside the government work report itself. Premier Li Keqiang's presentation of the keynote speech at the opening ceremony of the 13th National People's Congress was interrupted 60 times in less than 2 hours. He aroused great passion for some of the points he delivered. But in your review of the government's performance over the year, how do you rate the leadership of Premier Li Keqiang and, of course, President Xi Jinping?
I think that in the last 5 years, for this specific term of Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, our feeling is that I think they got a very, very strong execution capability in delivering what they promise to the country. For instance, last year, the GDP continued to grow at 6.9%, beating the projection of 6.5%. Overall, in the last few years, China has done a great job of really reducing the poverty population by 6 to 8 million people. That's pretty huge in number. And also, people's dispensable income is kind of really going up pretty nicely. Also, the confidence from the entrepreneur side, from business society, even from the entire population is getting stronger and stronger. So, as you can see, even the Chinese in the innovation side, we have a lot of programs in the past for entrepreneurs to create companies. Last year alone, over $100 billion US of VC and private equity money being put into the startup companies and entrepreneurs creating business and employing people. So that's something is amazing. It's the level of investment, innovation, and others kind of already catching that of the United States. Also, the company, for instance, some of the companies has grown from a smaller Chinese play into the global stage, such as Tencent and Alibaba, market cap being on the top 10 in the world. So that's something which we see the government has done a pretty good job in that area. Also, we feel that the government in the past, in addition to really focusing on the GDP growth, they've been paying attention to what we call high quality growth. Growth with environmental protection in mind, and we're starting to see clear skies in Beijing. I think those type of things clearly is something which we like very much.
Yes, residents in Beijing are particularly very happy about the APEC blue. We see more of such APEC blue skies in Beijing due to the high-handed policies that have been executed effectively by this generation of the Chinese leadership. Whatever China does and whatever Chinese leaders and politicians say, we always come under fire from Western media reports. They question the execution because of what they call autocracy, which is very different from their political institutions. Now, you are an expert in international studies. How do you rate the performance and the capability of the ruling party? I mean, China does not follow the Western vocabulary and discourse about the ruling party or not. However, the Chinese Communist Party is the biggest ruling party in the world with 80 million members. What do you think of their capacity of ruling?
Well, I think I would rate the ruling or the governance of the Chinese Communist Party as exceptional, good. It is, I think, manifested by the end of last year's 19th Party Congress. Has been seen, it's received so many, attentions, and both, positive and also negative. This is also showcase the importance of...
From the media perspective, all publicity is good publicity.
Right. And I would like to also mention about the diplomatic front. How far the past 5 years China has been going on. I think it has been transformational. Transformational in the sense that the Chinese diplomacy is becoming more proactive and more innovative. Proactive in the sense that, particularly in the sense of global governance. Look at the past 5 years, China has becoming more and more proactive in pushing, in presenting their views, their wisdoms, and in, working very hard together with the other emerging powers in shaping or reforming the global governance system. I think we have, in the past 5 years, we have seen 3 big events, starting with that APEC, that is, of course, for regional. Then came with the G20, it was in Hangzhou, and then followed with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, of course, is an iconic, one, raising, being acclaimed and by the world community as a whole, with participation of over 60 countries. And I think this is not easy if we compare to the year before. But of course, there's a long way to go. China taking the center of the global stage, there are more expectations, and there are more, of course, sometimes with more criticism. In the sense that what China is doing. But all in all, I believe that the past 5 years, the government led by President Xi and the Premier Li Keqiang did an excellent job.
Some of the Europeans say China is becoming less and less attractive as the economy develops so quickly. And the confidence that the Chinese display would always be viewed as assertive. And assertive is a negative word. Do you think we have entered into a post-West era? It's a new era, Chinese socialism with new characteristics. And therefore, the West have good reasons to fear that you are not one of us. You are different. Therefore, we have strong fears about the unpredictability of the Chinese way of development. What do you make of their concerns?
I think it's always understandable for two different societies with two different political systems, and also the culture and the view on things, to view things differently. If you look at China clearly, it is a one party who has very strong will, a vision to develop China into certain thing that is modern socialist country, with objectives, for example, by 2050 to be a great socialist country. The structures, the politicians involved in China, they're much more career politicians.
Some scholars compare the communist leadership as a board of directors, and the governance of China is compared to corporate governance. You are an expert of entrepreneurs. I mean, you yourself are an entrepreneur. Do you agree that this can be, examined in a parallel comparison?
It's very interesting comments you have. You just think of China as a corporation. You have the board of directors. You have the chairman, CEO, and you have a structure of executives, business units, leaders, following and the leadership of one strong CEO going to one direction. It's very, very similar to that. So in that situation, most likely the execution capability would be very, very strong. In the Western world, you would think that it is something where corporations may manage in a democratic way, where a lot of disputes can happen. You have check and balances, but also in the meantime, You could have sacrifice the efficiency of the execution, like Donald Trump today. It's in the United States where you have, if you look at Li Keqiang's speech, 60 times applause, and look at Donald Trump and the State of the Union speech over there. You have one side standing, which is the Republican, and clapping. You have other side that is not doing anything. What's happening over here is that just, to my understanding, is that it's just the difference of the culture and other things. So probably really to have the both sides, you mean the word assertive or other things, to have even more understanding in the community, to really understand what is the reason, what is the structure, what is the outcome people are desiring for.
In the second part of his government work report, the Premier Li Keqiang did address concerns on the adversity of the economy at home and abroad. Don't forget, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the financial meltdown that first broke out in Wall Street in the United States. We've heard multiple times the so-called cycle theory, which indicates every 10 years such a devastating financial crisis is likely to happen. Do you think China is prepared for the worst-case scenario?
Well, of course, China is prepared. It's prepared at any time. But before I go to that cycle theory, I would like go back to the miscorrect interpretation or misunderstanding of China's political system. I think the Western people, the West, has a big problem in understanding China's political system, in the sense because they are taking a wrong sort of framework. For them, the legitimacy comes from votes. While in the case of China, as we are talking about that analogy of board of directors, the legitimacy comes from performance. So the past 5 years and more, if you look at the Chinese Communist Party, the government leader, you would find that they are performing in a way, the performance itself tells large that it would continue. It has already won the support and applaud. That's why the 60 times applaud come when talk about the performances, talk about and also I think because of that sense of this sense, the Chinese Communist Party always have a very strong sense of a mission that they have to work hard, work more, and work higher. So coming back to that global financial crisis, of course, I think this is always the concerns. And I think if you look at again, the statements and the speeches of the government, the risks, financial risk like that, is always high on the agenda. I just believe that one of the three sort of risks facing Chinese economy.
Yeah, I think you raise a very good question. I think every 10 years there's a cycle. I think in China's financial systems, so I do have a lot of concerns, as a matter of fact. If you look at compare with China with the United States, I think the debt ratio to the GDP in China today is probably about more than 250%. In the U.S., probably 150%. If you look at M2, the broad money in concept, in China, it's probably about 200% of the GDP. In the U.S., about 100% of the GDP. When you have more money, your interest rate is supposed to be lower. But in China, the interbanking interest rate right now is about over 4%. While in the United States, probably 1%. So that really means that there are a lot of actually lending happening through different systems, P2P lending, shadow banks, and many others, that actually drive up the cost of lending.
What about the role of the SOE in the financial institutions? Do you think we attribute such fears of financial risks to the performance of the SOE? The underperformance of SOE has generated more concerns than the non-public sector. Yes,
but I think that overall, the numbers looks much bigger than that of the United States and others. It is a concern. That's why the government, in the next 3 years, I believe, will put a major effort of supervising the financial industry and deleveraging those risks. I think that's something is very clear. On SOE side, if you look at it, actually, you don't need to be too worried too much, because more than half of also the debt actually kind of being lent over to the SOE. The SOE is not, the ROI is not performing as good as in the private sectors. However, the government can control the the payment of those debt, right? So something with all the $3 trillion US worth of reserve I think in through execution capability can control the environment very well, the risk of the financial crisis. But clearly it is something where the government needs to resolve, otherwise could be a major issue.
Powerful measures have been rolled out to curb, for example, outflow of the capital. Therefore, merger and acquisition outside China becomes more difficult for people like you. Yeah. So do you think that's generated a lot of grievances from people in the non-public sector? And what message do these measures deliver to, for example, confidence of investors?
I think clearly the main thing for enterprises is that if you want to go global, I think that is supported by the government. I think in the last few years is that the issue is that a lot of money actually being invested outside China into property, into other things that has very little to do with the relationship with China. If you look at certain companies even today, like Fosun and others, have invested into the companies where, for example, the consumer goods brand, it is allowed, and you can bring those brands, luxury goods, into China, and through the huge market in China to distribute those goods. I think that's encouraged. Also for Chinese enterprises to go out to get market share in foreign countries to sell their product, and vice versa, those encouraged. So it's really depending upon what part of investment, what type of investment are you making.
Yeah. Despite the tight grip on outbound capital flight, Chile, one of the big automakers in China, purchased almost 10% of the bonds of Mercedes-Benz, and that generates a lot of headlines the world over. We have been assessing risks for the Chinese economic performance, and that leads to a very interesting question that has created many front-page stories for the world media in particular, the Constitution Amendment. Interesting enough, the Chinese perspective argues, look, the Constitution Amendment removes the term limits for the presidency and the vice presidency of the Republic in the hope of reducing risks and unpredictability. In contrast, ironically, the West argues the other way around. They say that will promote unpredictability. And they have there, as we argued before, entirely different political institutions to guarantee the regular power transfer and leadership change. What do you make of their sensational discussions about the Chinese politics?
I think it is also related to the question I raised, a point I raised before. But on this particular point of eliminating the term limits, I think there are some misunderstanding again. As we know that if you look at the Chinese, the party's constitution, and there are no term limits for the chairmanship of the party.
Or general secretary.
Or the general secretary, and also the chairmanship for the Central Military Commission. So and of course in the constitution we do have for the president and the vice presidents. They had two-term limits. So by eliminating that, I think it can bring these three positions in conformity, and which is very important in the Chinese context at this particular stage, where we believe that we need a more centralized, unified leadership with Comrade Xi Jinping as the party's general secretary as a whole. And it also helps to consolidate China, improve China's leadership system. So the West focusing too much on that, I think it's a misleading. And by the way, this is widely applauded by the deputies and also the Chinese people at large. And I would argue the most important thing is it sends out a strong signal of consistency and continuity of policy. Remember, the 19th Party Congress has set out a very clear blueprint and a work plan for China in the next 5, 15, and up to 2049. It's a long-term program. We need a strong leadership. We need a consistency of policy guidance. So I believe that if we go back to the analogy of the board of directors, if the board of directors, if the chairman of that board performs well, why don't you give him more chance so that it will continue to guide, continue to serve the stakeholders of that cooperation.
Mr. Chen, what was the immediate response from the stock market in the wake of announcing the removal of term limits?
Actually, I didn't pay attention to that.
My impression that the stock markets of China responded positively to that. Very much indeed. So that also tells that the market, as we know, is the most sensitive. One to that.
Premier Li Keqiang spoke of reform almost 100 times throughout the 2-hour presentation. Now, deep and comprehensive reform is obviously the catchphrase in the vocabulary of the Chinese politicians. What does reform mean from your perspective?
I think the reforms means a lot. It is commonly used words and can mean different things. For instance, this is the beginning of another 5 year. If you look at all, the state council, the government organizations, you could expect in the next 15 days a lot of announcement about the restructuring is going to happen. So that's a reform. If you're talking about the financial supervision systems, now you have 3 regulators. You have insurance, you have the banks, right? And so then, they might be putting together, and people are projecting those. You have tax reforms, where we have traditional tax systems. You have reforms on personal tax, property tax, other tax. And you have reforms on, for example, deleveraging the risk factors of the debt and everything else. So I think something, and also from the economic reform, which we mean, the private sectors, government sectors, having some of the private sectors invest into government sectors like BAT, Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, etc., invest into China Unicom is also type of reform. So that's something is really a reform is a word that's being utilized, being applied to many areas.
Regarding the issue of wealth, the Western media is clearly aware of the representation of the super rich guys. We have less billionaires this time around, but more wealth these guys represent for this plenary session of the NPC, the 13th National People's Congress. What does this number mean?
A very interesting number, because actually I also noticed that there were 26 lesser number of real estate tycoons in the
that's a very interesting barometer for the local revenue.
Exactly. And then, but however, there are a few additions to the members of the advisory and the body. That actually includes, for example, in addition to CEO of Tencent, others, you have addition of CEO of JD.com, Xiaomi, and many internet companies being invited into. You've also noticed that in the last few years, specifically last year, the market cap of Chinese internet companies has gone up quite a bit. Like Tencent from a $200 billion US company into over a $500 billion US company. Alibaba did the same, and many others. Those persons' wealth also more than doubled or tripled in the last few years. So adding together, we see a more new economy leaders into the, to Congress.
Well, too big to fail. However, given the lessons of the 2008 financial meltdown 10 years ago, do you think we should introduce a law to break up the monopoly? We should introduce antitrust law, because these guys, they have collected almost 90% of the resources. The small startup companies would find it very difficult to be successful.
Well, I would believe that all these multi-billionaires, they are very successful businessmen, and they are certainly the very smart one. And I think more importantly, I think they took the opportunity by, of course, utilizing the opportunities of China's emerging market, the potential. So I don't think it's a problem of restricting. Rather, to some extent, I think it should welcome their innovativeness.
Undeniably, excuse me, gentlemen, undeniably, there's the obsessive concerns for the skeptical viewers and netizens and policy observers that these guys could become the Chinese oligarchs. Well, this might be a joke, a very bad joke about the future of the Chinese super rich guys. Having said this, what about, say, the establishment of the Supervisory Commission? Will it be very different from the Supreme People's Procuratorate?
It is going to be different in the sense that it is now bring together these relevant departments either in the party's so-called disciplinary section or in the government section, where they also have functions like the anti-corruption or corruption prevention. So now with that supervisory commission, we have a more unified, more effective so the institution meant to cover all the functionaries across the board. I mean, not only the government, but also the parties, all the relevant departments funded by public fund. So it is, I think, response, very important effort meant to address the corruption issues, which I think the average people are very much concerned about.
For the entrepreneurs, Mr. Chen, what does a clean government mean for the success of a small, medium-sized enterprise of the non-public sector?
I think we would very welcome the government's initiative to do the anti-corruption, because everything becomes transparent. You don't need to worry about having multiple rubber stamps to be stamped before you're getting approval for things. You don't need to worry about bribery, and you can compete according to your own capability. I think China has been doing very well in the last few years of really executing this anti-corruption policy, and we've seen the benefit of it.
We have less than 1 minute to cover the last question, which is also very important. CNN did a headline story about an increase of 8% in our military spending very quickly. Do you think that represents their concerns on the so-called China threat?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the military is, let me first of all, every country is rising. The United States is rising very fast, 10%. And the United States, it has the largest military budget. Over total of the next more than next 7 countries, 7 big ones. So China is, I think, the military budget is meant to make up the deficit of investment, and more important, is meant to improve the living standards of the army, and particularly, I think, the conditions of those soldiers in rural, in grassroots level. So I don't think it's a normal, it's a moderate growth, and I think should accept it, take it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
China is prepared to become a major maritime power, and that requires money. That's perhaps one of the reasons behind the concerns of the U.S. media. I'll see you next time, the same time tomorrow, about Voices and Votes, a special coverage on the current plenary session of the NPC and CPTC. Goodbye.